Our last mm, monthly Bhagavad Gita discourse was in the beginning of April, so we have missed May and June, 2 months. We hope that everyone is faring well. So today we will be resuming from chapter 6. I will just take a few minutes to recite a few short prayers, and then we can begin with our discourse. Om Agyana Timirandasya Gyananjana Shalakaya Chakshurunmilitam Jena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha. Shri Chaitanya Manobhistam Stapitam Jena Bhutale Swayam Rupa Kadamahyam Dadati Swapadantikam Nama Om Vishnu Padaya Krishna Pristhaya Bhutale Srimate Bhakti Vedanta Swamin Iti Namine Namaste Saraswati Devi Gaudavani Pracharine Nirvishesha Shunyavadi Paschata Deshatarine Jaya Sri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Sri Advaita Gadadhar Srivasadi Gaura Bhakta Vrinda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare. So once again, welcome to all of you. Those who have the Bhagavad Gita, our process has been to actually read the text from the particular chapter, today being chapter 6, entitled Dhyana Yoga. And after the reading, which generally takes about 15, maximum 20 minutes, then we will already have selected a few verses. We will also be leaving some time at the end of our presentation, at least 10 minutes, possibly more, for any possible comments or questions on what we have been hearing. Bhagavad Gita, we should keep in mind, is referred to as perennial knowledge. Means it's the oldest, most ancient knowledge. It is universal knowledge as well. When one reads and takes the time to properly analyze the knowledge presented in the Bhagavad Gita, one comes to understand that it is indeed a very scientific knowledge as well. And it covers many different aspects, actually all the basic essential aspects of both material life and spiritual life. So in that sense, it is also most complete, and it is the basis for understanding. It is, we could say, a prerequisite for understanding literatures such as the Srimad Bhagavatam, or known also as the Bhagavad Purana. So therefore, Bhagavad Gita is the basis. It is referred to as the ABC of spiritual life. So part of what we should be doing in terms of actually of all Vedic literatures is to hear attentively, to hear as nicely as possible. And naturally, Bhagavad Gita, for those who do take the time to read on a regular basis, and regular basis means more than once a month. We're doing once a month online, but in our homes we should be doing once a day, actually. Many great personalities, philosophers, including scientists, have praised the Bhagavad Gita since many decades, if not centuries as well. So let us try to immerse ourselves in what we will be hearing today. Naturally, even one verse from Bhagavad Gita is generally that's what we do. We select one verse and we speak, one can speak for hours on such one verse. However, we're not giving the regular kind of, let's say, discourse or class that we give in our temples. We're basically trying to give an overview of the Bhagavad Gita, going from chapter to chapter, and trying to imbibe and hear nicely these instructions. As you will be hearing the verses I will be reciting, basically I will recite the Sanskrit as well as the English translation. You may want to make some note in case something is not clear, and then we can get back to that. So I will begin with text number 1, and that is Lord Krishna who is speaking. Again, this is chapter 6, Dhyana Yoga. Sri Bhagavan Uvacha Anasrita Karma Phalam Karyam Karma Karoti Yaha Sa Sanyasi Cha Yogi Cha Naniragnir Na Chakriyaha. The Supreme Personality of Godhead said, one who is unattached to the fruits of his work and who works as he is obligated is in the renounced order of life, and he is the true mystic, not he who lights no fire and performs no duty. Yam sanyasam iti prahur yogam matam vidhi pandava naya sanyasta sankalpo yogi bhavati kaschana. What is called renunciation, you should know to be the same as yoga, or linking oneself with the Supreme, O son of Pandu. For one can never become a yogi unless he renounces the desire for sense gratification. Arurukshor munere yogam karma karanam uchyate yoga rudhasya tasyaiva shama karanam uchyate. For one who is a neophyte in the eightfold yoga system, work is said to be the means. And for one who is already elevated in yoga, cessation of all material activities is said to be the means. Yada hi nendriyartheshu nakarmasva nusajjate sarva sankalpa sannyasi yoga rudhas tato jate. A person is said to be elevated in yoga when, having renounced all material desires, he neither acts for sense gratification nor engages in fruitive activities. Udharet atmanat manam nat manam avasadayat atmaiva yatmano bandhur atmaiva ripur atmanaha. One must deliver himself with the help of his mind and not degrade himself. The mind is a friend of the conditioned soul and his enemy as well. Bandhur atmatmanastasya yenat maivatmanajitaha anatmanas tu shatrutve vate tat maiva shatruvat. For him who has conquered the mind is the best of friends. But for one who has failed to do so, his mind will remain the greatest enemy. Jitatmana prashantasya paramatma samahitaha shitoshna sukkadukeshu tatha mana amanayoho. For one who has conquered the mind, the super soul is already reached, for he has attained tranquility. To such a man, happiness and distress, heat and cold, honor and dishonor are all the same. Jnana vijnana triptatma kutosto vichitendriya yukta ityuchyate yogi samalostrashma kanchanaha. A person is said to be established in self-realization and is called a yogi or mystic when he is fully satisfied by virtue of acquired knowledge and realization. Such a person is situated in transcendence and is self-controlled. He sees everything, whether it be pebbles, stones, or gold, as the same. Sudrin mitrarya Surin mitraryudasina Madhyasta dvesha bandhushu sadhushvapi tapapeshu samabudhir vishishyate. A person is considered still further advanced when he regards honest well-wishers, affectionate benefactors, the neutral, mediators, the envious, friends and enemies, the pious and the sinners, all with an equal mind. Yogi yunjita satatam atmanam rahasistitaha ekaki yata chitatma nirashir aparigraha. A transcendentalist should always engage his body, mind, and self in relationship with the Supreme. He should live alone in a secluded place and should always carefully control his mind. He should be free from desires and feelings of possessiveness. Sacho deshe pratistapya stiram asanam atmanaha natyuchritam nati nicham chailajina kushotaram tatrai kagram manakritva yata chitendriya kriyaha upavishya sane yunjad yogam atma vishuddhaye. To practice yoga, one should go to a secluded place and should lay kusha grass on the ground and then cover it with a deer skin and a soft cloth. The seat should be neither too high nor too low and should be situated in a sacred place. The yogi should then sit on it very firmly and practice yoga to purify the heart by controlling his mind, senses, and activities, and fixing the mind on one point. Samamakayam shirogrivam dharayan achalam stiraha sampraksha nasikagram swam dishas chanabalokayan prashantatma vigatabhir brahmachari vrate stitaha mana samyamya mach chitto yukta asita mat paraha. One should hold one's body, neck, and head erect in a straight line and stare steadily at the tip of the nose. Thus, with an unagitated subdued mind, devoid of fear, completely free from sex life. One should meditate upon me within the heart and make me the ultimate goal of life. Yunjan evam sadatmanam yogi niyata manasaha shantim nirvana paramam mat samstam adhikachyati. Thus practicing constant control of the body, mind, and activities, the mystic transcendentalist, his mind regulated, attains to the kingdom of God or the abode of Krishna by cessation of material existence. Natyasnatastu yogosti nachaikantam anasnataha nachati swapna shilasya jagato naiva charjuna. There is no possibility of one's becoming a yogi, O Arjuna, if one eats too much or eats too little, sleeps too much or does not sleep enough. Yaktahara viharasya yukta chestasya karmasu yukta swapna vabodhasya yogo bhavati dukkaha. He who is regulated in his habits of eating, sleeping, recreation, and work can mitigate all material pains by practicing the yoga system. Yada viniyatam chittam atmanyeva vatistate nispriha sarva kamebhyo yukta ityuchate tada. When the yogi, by practice of yoga, disciplines his mental activities and becomes situated in transcendence, devoid of all material desires, he is said to be well established in yoga. Yata dipo nivatasto nangate sopama smita yogino yata chittasya yunjato yogam atmanaha. As a lamp in a windless place does not waver, so the transcendentalist, whose mind is controlled, remains always steady in his meditation on the transcendent self. Yatro paramate chittam niruddham yoga sevaya yatra shaivat manatmanam pashyan atmani tushyati sukham achantikam yattad buddhi grahyam atindriyam veti yatra nachaivayam sitash chalati tatvataha yam labdva chaparam labham manyate nadhikam tataha yasmin stito nadhukkena gurunapi vichalyate tam vidyad dukkha samyoga viryogam yoga samnitam. In the stage of perfection called trance or samadhi, one's mind is completely restrained from material mental activities by practice of yoga. This perfection is characterized by one's ability to see the self by the pure mind and to relish and rejoice in the self. In that joyous state, one is situated in boundless transcendental happiness, realized through transcendental senses. Established thus, one never departs from the truth, and upon gaining this, he thinks there is no greater gain. Being situated in such a position, one is never shaken, even in the midst of greatest difficulty. This indeed is actual freedom from all miseries arising from material contact. Na nischayena yoktavyo yogo nirvina chetasam sankalpa prabhavan kamams taktva sarvan asheshataha mana saivendriya gramam viniyamya samantataha. One should engage oneself in the practice of yoga with determination and faith, and not be deviated from the path. One should abandon, without exception, all material desires born of mental speculation, and thus control all the senses on all sides by the mind. Shanai Shanair Uparamid Buddhya Driti Vihitaya Atma Samstam Mana Kritva Na Kinchid Api Chintayet. Gradually, step by step, one should become situated in trance by means of intelligence sustained by full conviction. And thus the mind should be fixed on the self alone and should think of nothing else. Yato nischalati manas chanchalam astiram tatastato niyam yaitad atmanyeva vasham nayet. From wherever the mind wanders due to its flickering and unsteady nature, one must certainly withdraw it and bring it back under the control of the self. Prashanta manasam yenam yoginam sukham uttamam upaiti shanta rajasam brahmabhutam akalmasham. The yogi whose mind is fixed on me verily attains the highest perfection of transcendental happiness. He is beyond the mode of passion. He realizes his qualitative identity with the Supreme, and thus he is freed from all reaction to past deeds. Yunjan evam sadatmanam yogi vigata kalmashaha sukena brahma samsparsham achantam sukham ashnute. Thus, the self-control yogi, constantly engaged in yoga practice, becomes free from all material contamination and achieves the highest stage of perfect happiness in transcendental loving service to the Lord. Sarva bhutastam atmanam sarva bhutani chatmani ikshate yoga yuktatma sarvatra sama darshanaha. A true yogi observes me in all beings and also sees every being in me. Indeed, the self-realized person sees me, the same Supreme Lord, everywhere. Yo mam pashyati sarvatra sarvam mayi pashyati tasyaham na pranashyami na cha me na pranashyati. For one who sees me everywhere and sees everything in me, I am never lost, nor is he ever lost to me. Sarva bhuta stitam yomam bhajatye katvam astitaha sarvata vartamanopi sayogi Mayi Vartate. Such a yogi who engages in the worshipful service of the Super Soul, knowing that I and the Super Soul are one, remains always in me in all circumstances. Atmo pamyena sarvatra samam pashati yorjuna sukham va yadi va dukkham sayogi paramo mataha. He is a perfect yogi who, by comparison to his own self, sees the true equality of all beings in both their happiness and their distress, O Arjuna. Arjuna uvacha yo yam yogas tvaya prokta samyena madhusudana etasyaham napashyami chanchalat vat stitim stiram. Arjuna said, O Madhusudana, the system of yoga which you have summarized appears impractical and unendurable to me, for the mind is restless and unsteady. Chanchalam himana Krishna pramati balavad dridham tasyaham vigraham manye vayor eva suduskaram. For the mind is restless, turbulent, obstinate, and very strong, O Krishna. And to subdue it, I think, is more difficult than controlling the wind. Sri Bhagavan Uvacha Asam Shayam Mahabahu Mano Durnigraham Chalam Abhyasena Tukonteya Vairagyena Shagriyate. Lord Sri Krishna said, O mighty armed son of Kunti, it is undoubtedly very difficult to curb the restless mind, but it is possible by suitable practice and by detachment. Asamyat mana yogo asamyanat mana yogo dusprapa iti me matihi vyasatmana tu yatata shakyo vaptum upayataha. For one whose mind is unbridled, self-realization is difficult work. But he whose mind is controlled and who strives by appropriate means is assured of success. That is my opinion. Arjuna uvacha ayati sradhayo peto yogats chalita manasaha aprapya yoga samsiddhim kam gatim Krishna gacchati. Arjuna said, O Krishna, what is the destination of the unsuccessful transcendentalist who in the beginning takes to the process of self-realization with faith, but who later desists due to worldly mindedness and thus does not attain perfection in mysticism? Kachin no bhaya vibhrastas china brahma eva nashyati apratisto mahabaho vimudho brahmana prati. O mighty armed Krishna, does not such a man who is bewildered from the path of transcendence fall away from both spiritual and material success and perish like a riven cloud with no position in any sphere? Etam me samshayam Krishna chetum arhasya sheshataha tvad anya samshayasyasya chitta nahi prapadyate. This is my doubt, O Krishna, and I ask you to dispel it completely. But for you, no one is to be found who can destroy this doubt. Sri Bhagavan Uvacha Partha Naiveha Namutra Vinashastasya Vidyate Nahi Kalyana Krit Kaschid Durgatim Tatagaschati. The Supreme Personality said, O son of Pritha, a transcendentalist engaged in auspicious activities does not meet with destruction either in this world or in the spiritual world. One who does good, my friend, is never overcome by evil. Prapya punya kritam lokan usitva shasvati samaha Suchinam Srimatam Gehe Yoga Bhrasto Bhujayate. The unsuccessful yogi, after many years of enjoyment on the planets of the pious living entities, is born into a family of righteous people or into a family of rich aristocracy. Athavai yoginam eva kule bhavati dhi matam etad dhi dolabhattaram loke janma yadidrisham. Or, if unsuccessful after long practice of yoga, he takes his birth in a family of transcendentalists who are surely great in wisdom. Certainly, such a birth is rare in this world. Tatra tam buddhi samyogam labhate purva dehikam yatate cha tato bhuya samsidhau kudunandana. On taking such a birth, he revives the divine consciousness of his previous life, and he again tries to make further progress in order to achieve complete success, O son of Kuru. Purva vyasena tenaiva riyate yavasho pisaha jignasur apiyogasya shabda brahmativartate. By virtue of the divine consciousness of his previous life, he automatically becomes attracted to the yogic principles, even without seeking them. Such an inquisitive transcendentalist stands always above the ritualistic principles of the scriptures. Prayatnad yatamanastu yogi samshuddha kilbishaha aneka janma samsiddhas tato yati param gatim. And when the yogi engages himself with sincere endeavor in making further progress, being washed of all contaminations, then ultimately achieving perfection after many births of practice, he attains the supreme goal. Tapa vibhyo dhiko yogi jnanibhyo vimato dhika karmibhyas chadiko yogi tasmad yogi bhavarjuna. A yogi is greater than the ascetic, greater than the empiricist, and greater than the fruitive worker. Therefore, O Arjuna, in all circumstances, be a yogi. Yoginam api sarvesham mad gatenam taratmana sradhavam bhajate yomam same yukta tamo mataha. And of all yogis, the one with great faith who always abides in me thinks of me within himself and renders transcendental loving service to me. He is the most intimately united with me in yoga and is the highest of all. That is my opinion. This ends our reading of the 6th chapter of the Bhagavad Gita, entitled Dhyana Yoga. So Dhyana Yoga refers to the yoga of meditation. In the Bhagavad Gita, there are different types of yoga explained by Lord Krishna to Arjuna. We have seen in previous chapters about karma yoga. We have heard about jnana yoga. Actually, in the very last purport of the last verse, in the purport of the last verse, rather, Srila Prabhupada summarizes and explains how there is a certain gradation of yoga systems, generally beginning with karma yoga, rising to jnana yoga, and then dhyana yoga, through the practice of Astanga yoga. And of all the yogas, as Srila Prabhupada explains in many places through his purports, one needs to come to the level of bhakti yoga. I have chosen a few verses. I'll just read them. They are very key verses that Prabhupada would often refer to, that can help us in our practice, in our endeavor to put into practice these teachings from the Bhagavad Gita. So one of the first that I have underlined here is text number 26, which is especially of importance when one takes up to the process of devotional service, or whenever someone takes up any form of yoga. Our greatest, we could say, disturbance is our mind. So this verse 26, I'll just read, well, I can read the Sanskrit, yeah. Yato yato nischalati manas chanchalam astiram tatastato niyam yaitad atmanyeva vasham nayet. From wherever the mind wanders due to its flickering and unsteady nature, one must certainly withdraw it and bring it back under the control of the self. So it means that actually up and until we take up to the process of yoga, again, any form of yoga, our greatest distraction and greatest enemy in the beginning will be our mind, because for so many lifetimes we learn from the Bhagavad Gita that the living entity is eternal, is the eternal part and parcel. Mamai vangsho jiva loke jiva bhuta sanatana, sanatana, eternal. So since time immemorial, practically speaking, our mind has been uncontrolled. And it is only when we attain a human form of life, if we are very fortunate to come in contact with this knowledge of the Bhagavad Gita, which generally happens through devotees who are themselves practicing bhakti yoga, then we can begin that process. And therefore, the very practical instruction being given here by Krishna, that we will immediately understand and notice that our mind is always wandering. especially when we chant the holy name, when we chant japa, for example. So this is a very important instruction that we must endeavor to be conscientious of our practice of yoga, again, whatever yoga it may be, to endeavor and fix our mind. And again, Krishna later on in text 34, it is Arjuna who is explaining to Krishna that actually, I think it's impossible to control the mind. Chanchalam himana Krishna pramati balavad dridham. The translation, for the mind is restless, turbulent, obstinate, very strong, O Krishna. And to subdue it, I think, is more difficult than controlling the wind, which is true. But Krishna answers very nicely that although it is difficult to control the mind, it is possible. So this in itself should be a reassurance for us. Krishna is telling, yes, it is difficult, but it is possible, and he gives two ways by which it is possible. Abhyasena tukonteya vairagyena chagriyate. Abhyas means by practice. And vairagya means detachment. Again, actually spiritual life, especially when we read the wonderful explanations given by our founder Acharya Srila Prabhupada, spiritual life, and in particular, I would say Bhakti Yoga, the topmost level of yoga, is very down to earth. It is very practical. It takes into consideration our present situation in this material body, in this material world. So spiritual life is not simply something so subtle that we cannot capture. Of course, it is subtle. It is very esoteric because it's the most confidential knowledge as well that is given by the Lord. But its application is very down to earth, is very practical, and it is intimately connected with our lifestyle every day, and therefore there are direct and practical suggestions in the verses that we read today. In one such instruction, Krishna is telling that to be a yogi will not be possible if one eats too much or eats too little, if one sleeps too much or sleeps too little. So these are practical instructions, and our acharyas have given very concrete instructions in that regards. How, for example, one should try to minimize one's sleeping. So Prabhupada has indicated one should sleep between 6 and 8 hours. Those who are, the more one is advanced in Krishna consciousness, one will be able to reduce one's sleeping. One will be able to reduce one's different material necessities of life. But one should not do this artificially. We know that the Goswamis of Vrindavan, they were sleeping very, very little. I mean, it is described that sometimes they would forget to sleep. That doesn't happen to many of us. I don't think so. Srila Prabhupada is also a more, we could say, recent example. As our founder Acharya, he would not sleep more than 3 hours, maximum 4 hours, sometimes less as well. Most of the Goswamis in Vrindavan, the associates of Lord Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, they would sleep 1 or 2 hours as well, because their mind was completely absorbed in transcendence. Again, we cannot imitate that. Just going just 1 or 2 more verses very quickly, so that we have a little time for some questions that might be there. Something very important, because Arjuna is asking, what happens to those who are not successful? Then Krishna assures him, nothing is lost. Anyone who is taken to the process of Krishna consciousness, even if one does not succeed fully in this lifetime, he is guaranteed a human form of life. He's guaranteed a human birth in the next life, and that human birth either in a family of brahmanas or kshatriyas, pious family or aristocratic family. And of course, the last verse of the chapter, verse 47, Yoginam api sarvesham, very well-known verse. And of all yogis, the one with great faith who always abides in me, thinks of me within himself and renders transcendental loving service to me, he is the most intimately united with me in yoga and is the highest of all. That is my opinion. This is how Krishna concludes this chapter on Dhyana Yoga. So naturally, as I mentioned a little earlier, there are many more things to be said, obviously. We'll stop here and take some either comments or questions. You can possibly raise your hand, or you could send it on the chat, I suppose, as well. Yeah, so you have a choice of either using chat to send a question or comment, or raising your hand. Okay, I see a few hands up here. I'll just take, let's see, as I see them on my screen here. Please don't forget to unmute when I will recognize you. Champakalata Devidasi. Yes, unmute. Yes.
Hare Krishna Maharaj, Dandavat Pranams.
Hare Krishna.
Maharaj, I have a small question here of text 36, where in the translation, Lord Krishna is saying, but he whose mind is controlled and who strives by appropriate means is assured of success. Maharaj, can you just tell us a few appropriate means? Of course, we do the chanting and maybe the deity worship and like a few things we already do in devotional service, but can you zero down to few main things which we should be doing every day?
Yes, of course. As you rightly mentioned, there are some basic practices that devotees are meant to perform or follow every day. And the chanting is one of the foremost important activities that we should be doing, because as we all know, it is identified and explained as being the Yuga Dharma for the sage of Kali. So the chanting, and Prabhupada also explains why we should be chanting 16 rounds. That's also important, because especially in Kali Yuga, the forces of Maya are so powerful that if we don't sufficiently protect ourselves by chanting this minimum of 16 rounds, then we will be less protected, basically. And so the chanting of the holy name is of paramount importance. Of great importance as well is associating with devotees. And of course, taking prasadam, Srila Prabhupada explains, is also immensely important, because whenever we don't take food that is offered to the Lord, this has a negative effect or influence on our consciousness. So the various details of what we should be doing as devotees on a daily basis are nicely explained actually by Srila Rupa Goswami in the Nectar of Devotion. So basically we should be, as Krishna explains here, we should be striving through these different processes that is referred to here as appropriate means, and we mentioned a few of them. You also mentioned some, and there are more that are there in the Shastra. Hare Krishna.
Hare
We'll
Krishna
go-
Maharaj.
yes.
Thank you, sir.
Okay, we'll recognize, let's see, Krishna Chandra. Please, go ahead.
Hare Krishna Maharaj.
Yes.
Hare Krishna Pandit Maharaj. So Maharaj, in this chapter, Krishna is recommending abhyasena to vairagyena, practice and detachment.
Yes.
We can control the mind.
Yes.
So normally tapasvis, even though they are not devotees, they try this process. But in the 7th chapter, 14th verse, Krishna is saying, unless and until you surrender to me, Daivi Hesham Gunamayi Mama Maya Duritya Mame Vaye Prapadyante Maya Metam Taranti. That means unless and until you don't surrender to me, you cannot cross this Maya. So surrendering process, without surrendering process also, can they control the mind, these yogis?
Okay, there is a verse, as you well know, Brahmabhuta Prasanatma Nasochati Nakanchati. This particular verse refers to the level of Brahman realization that one can attain by the practice of yoga, whereby one is no longer agitated, has no hankering and no lamentation. So one can attain, a certain level and become unaffected by the miseries of this material world and attain Brahman realization, which is not at all an easy level to attain. And that level actually situates one above the dualities of this material world. But as you rightly point out by quoting the verse you did, unless we reestablish our connection, and which means our relationship with Krishna, then we will, even one who reaches the Brahman realization, who attains the Brahmajyoti, as Prabhupada explains, because he's not engaged, he's not having his proper natural eternal engagement as servant of Krishna, he must again come back. And that verse is also there. Bhukti mukti siddhi kami sakhale ashanta. Krishna bhakta niskama ataiva shanta. So that verse is explaining that even the yogis, the karmis, the gyanis, and even the yogis who may attain this very high level of Brahman realization, if they are not engaged in Krishna's service, if they don't know about Krishna, and that's why in other places Srila Prabhupada explains, and Krishna himself explains in the very last verse, one of the last verses of the Bhagavad Gita, to abandon all different types of yoga systems and simply, surrender unto me. So there is a certain level of transcendence that one can attain. This chapter of Dhyana Yoga is speaking especially about meditation, but that meditation ultimately must lead one to the highest level of realization or highest level of meditation, which is to fix one's mind on the Supreme Personality of Godhead. There's more to be said, but we'll just keep it at that for now because there's a few more hands up, if that's okay.
Thank you very much, Maharaj. Thank you very much.
So, Rishi Kumar, Prabhu, yes. We'll come to our other two devotees in a few seconds. Yes.
Guru Maharaj, my question is, can Varnashram Dharma can help us to attain like Vairagi and that abhyas which Krishna is talking about?
Okay, your line was breaking a little bit, but I'll just repeat it. Can Varnasrama help us in the practice of abhyasa and vairagya? If I understood correct. Yes, okay. Yes, actually the system created by Lord Krishna himself, as he states in the Bhagavad Gita, is that natural material system which most easily and more quickly will help us to become detached from this material world and which will help us to take up, adopt different practices that will very quickly bring us to the desired goal of actually, for example, become situated in the mode of goodness. The whole Varnasrama system is meant to gradually elevate individuals from the lower modes of material nature to the mode of goodness, and of course, beyond the mode of goodness. Evam prasanamanaso bhagavad bhakti yogataha bhagavat tattva vijnanam mukta sangyasya jayate, as explained nicely in the Bhagavatam. So yes, the system of Varnasrama, one can of course take directly to Bhakti Yoga, but generally we do that through sadhana, and we should see and understand Varnasrama as part of sadhana. Sadhana means accepting and following different rules and regulations. So in Varnasrama, there are natural rules and regulations also to be followed. And when all of those are dovetailed for the service and for the pleasure of Krishna, then we attain more quickly. And that's the verdict of our acharyas, like Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur and Srila Prabhupada himself, who mentioned that Varnasrama system is there to actually facilitate more easily someone to actually become a Vaishnava. Hare Krishna. Okay, we have a few hands that I see. Yes, Nilanjana Sanyal Mataji, please, you can unmute yourself. Not unmuted. Yes.
Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna. Yes.
Hare Krishna.
Please, go ahead. You have a question?
All to the Divine Acharyas. I have a question. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes, please go ahead.
Yes. What is this? Or is it moksha liberation? Please pardon my ignorance. Or what is it? Detachment and moksha liberation. What is it? These are the concepts I wanted to clear.
Okay, yes, very good question. The word moksha, and of course the word liberation comes very often. Even there are three levels, we could say, of liberation. Moksha, the ultimate moksha means, of course, to become completely freed from this material world and to become reinstated, reestablished in our natural eternal relationship with Krishna. So we hear about dharma, artha, kama, and moksha. Generally, that moksha is referring to something that is impersonal. Real moksha, becoming freed from the dualities of the material world, becoming freed from the hankering and lamentations that are there in the material world, can only be attained when one reconnects with the Supreme Personality of Godhead, Krishna. So there is a temporary moksha, we could say, for those who attain Brahman realization. The verse we quoted earlier, Brahma Bhuta Prasanatman Asochati Nakanchati. They are no longer affected by the dualities of the material world, but they are not yet fully liberated until and unless they re-establish through Bhakti Yoga. Bhakti Yoga means that process of establishing our personal relationship with Krishna. This is all very nicely explained in various purports in the Bhagavad Gita. So we can just leave it at that for now. And you can find out more by reading some of these other purports. very quickly, let's see, here is Pran Govinda Prabhu. And
Hare
then
Krishna, Guru
Dhamsuru.
Maharaj.
Yeah, yes.
Guru Maharaj, my question is, where does the current system of yoga, asanas, Ayurveda, etc. falls down in the current practice of Krishna consciousness movement? How to place them in the regular life of a devotee?
Where there's practices like Astanga Yoga and Ayurveda.
I mean, yoga, asanas, and Ayurveda, etc.
Okay, they are very much part of the Vedic knowledge. Ayurveda is one of the recognized and established sciences in terms of being the most ideal and natural health system, and therefore, ideally, devotees in general, they prefer taking this type of treatment, Ayurvedic treatment, over other forms of treatment. And in terms of yoga, yoga can be helpful in many different ways and is also very much authorized. So devotees can take help from these different activities so that they can be for some, for example, who are having certain health issues or who would like to keep their body fit by practicing yoga is very conducive, and by taking Ayurvedic medicine as well. So they are bona fide, authorized, but they must be always kept in relation to Krishna. Yeah. Last, so we'll close here, except Vamshuli. Vamshuli, the last question for today. Go ahead, Prabhu.
Maharaj. Please accept my humble obeisances, Maharaj.
Haribol, Hare Krishna.
My question is that currently I am working in a typical corporate job.
Yes.
And I have some desire to serve Srila Prabhupada in some way. The mental platform, sometimes I feel I have some desire to still continue in the city, or because of some obligations I have. But there is some form of immature renunciation where I feel detachment, or like maybe not detachment, but dislike for the job. And perhaps that is driving me to take more interest in establishing some form of service where I can find an engagement which can overcome the distaste I'm having for doing a typical job. But I'm trying to understand whether it is my mind trying to cheat me from doing the assigned activity or the karma which has come through the course of nature, or should I actually give it up because it is not, it is actually ugra karma, not even akarma.
Okay. Yeah. Well, it's an interesting question and an important one as well. Unfortunately, we cannot give very much time to it as such, but there is definitely an aspect which is not, let's say, connected with Maya, in the sense that all of us as devotees, the more we understand the frail condition in which we find ourselves, not only in general in terms of this material world, but in terms of modern day society and how society is wrongly arranged, and how, Prabhupada has told us that modern day civilization will one day fail all of us because it is based on unsustainable concepts and principles. And therefore, Srila Prabhupada urged and wanted all of us to realize and understand the importance of simple living and high thinking, which of course, to some extent can be practiced anywhere, but is meant especially to be practiced in the ideal Vedic lifestyle that the Vedic culture is actually promoting, which is actually village lifestyle. So, of course, every individual, we all have our individual, very personal situation. And I would simply suggest that you discuss with devotees who are maybe a bit more knowledgeable or more senior to determine whether your, a mind, your thoughts and the pros and cons that your mind is giving, whether it is that's something positive or negative, whether it is healthy or unhealthy. In some cases, it will be healthy if it is meant to actually further advance the mission of our Krishna consciousness movement, the mission of Srila Prabhupada, which is to actually reestablish the Vedic culture, because the vast majority of us, and I believe, as you described a little earlier in describing your present occupation, the vast majority of people in the world, including, unfortunately, the vast majority of our devotees, are engaged in non-traditional occupation. And it means non-natural occupations, which are really, in many ways, devastating, because it is not helping us in many ways to practice as we ideally should our practices of Krishna consciousness. It's again, it's an interesting question, very important one as well. I would suggest to hear more about what Srila Prabhupada says in that context, and also consult with devotees who are having some realizations on this aspect as well. I definitely would like to say more about it, but we are already over our time. So I would like to take this opportunity to thank all of you for joining us today. And hopefully we will be continuing again. And everyone can, as we finish our session today, everyone can unmute and we can all together recite the Hare Krishna Mahamantra. Hare Krishna,
Krishna, Hare Krishna,
Krishna
Krishna
Hare Hare,
Hare
Hare Rama,
Rama, Hare
Rama
Rama,
Rama,
Rama
Hare
Rama,
Hare.
Hare.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Nice.
Dandavat Maharaj. Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama,
Hare
Hare
Rama,
Rama,
Rama Rama, Hare.
Hare Krishna.